Hi everyone, welcome to my channel and to my studio where today I'm going to show you how to salvage leftover pastel pigment and bits and pieces of pastels and turn them back into pastel sticks. I'll tell you more about why I'm doing this in just a minute, but if you enjoy this and you find it helpful, then please do hit subscribe here on YouTube. It costs nothing to support me in that way, and you'll discover lots and lots of videos about soft pastels if you do. Also, consider checking me out over on Patreon, where you'll discover my full library of real-time tutorials and lots of behind-the-scenes stuff from my studio. I can't believe that I've never tried to make pastels from my leftover pigment. That's mostly because I don't tend to have that much dust fall off while I paint, and I tend to use those tiny little shards of pastel right down to the last holdable crumb. But there is a good reason why I have so much dust to play with right now. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was going to do a workshop in Dublin, and the day before I left here, I went out for a couple of hours, and for the first time ever, I did not close my studio door all the way shut. Now, my dog Django, who is a rescue who has been with us for about 5 months at this stage, got into the room and then somehow he managed to close the door shut behind him. So he didn't come in here to intentionally do any damage, but once that door clicked shut, he panicked. I have honestly never ever faced such a sight as I saw that day. And on top of that, the horror of thinking that perhaps he ate some stuff that would make him unwell. But thankfully, he was totally fine, and he went on a lovely long walk with my other dog and my partner while I started to clean up. What I didn't have time to clean before my trip away was my pastel trays. And he did quite a number on those because they sit underneath a window, and he was clearly trying to find a way out through the window. So he danced quite a bit on my lovely pastel trays. Well, here you can see what the trays should look like. And here they are now. This yellow and green tray was probably the worst hit. But Django has at least gifted me the experience of making some fresh pastel sticks out of this mess. So I'm not going to share the entire cleaning process with you, as I already have quite a few videos on my channel here showing you how I clean and also how I colour organise my palette. So I'll just show you a few snippets of the cleaning process. I'm using little sheets of toilet roll, which is my go-to when it comes to cleaning pastels. I know a lot of people use something like dry rice or cornstarch and shake the pastels in a container with that, but this was just too much mess. They really needed a lot of rubbing, and you can see here how much tissue paper I'm getting through. This is the first tray cleaned, and you can see I've got a bit of a gap here in my dark greens because this is where Django seemed to dance the most. So I can definitely feel a dark green shopping spree coming on in the near future. But I was also pleasantly surprised by how many sticks I did actually manage to salvage. You can see that the majority of the full sticks that I had did come back, they did clean up. And then this is the mess that I'm left with. So a lot of dust and a lot of little shards like this. And I'll go back through this box and take out any shards that I can make use of, because these are always useful when painting. But there is a limit to just how many shards I need.
And I think it'll probably just be better to crush most of what's here up and make some full sticks again. And just as I'm starting to lack motivation, here's the little man himself coming in to gee me on and get the rest of this task done. I mean, how could you be angry with that face? Look at him. So that is the blue violet tray now done as well. 2 out of 3. And this one wasn't so bad. That's all the pigment really that got crushed out of that one. But I will make use of all of this. Everything will get collected and will go into the mix. But at least now I've got 2 of 3 trays done. So just one more left to go. And then we can start the process of making some pastels.
Oh, that was really not fun. Quite soul destroying to lift up pastels and have them crumble to pieces between your fingertips. But the plus side is I'll show you now the clean trays. These are now looking okay again. I can finally start to paint because I can finally see my colours again. You'll notice they're a little bit sparse. I have more spaces now because I have actually lost quite a lot of pastels. And then these are the 3 trays that I took them out of. So luckily I had 3 extra trays, which was good. And I could just clean each box out into the new tray. But yeah, that's a lot of pigment. And this tray was also quite bad. There's a lot of pigment in here. Just look at all of that. But we're going to make some new pastels out of all of this. I kept one little piece in the paper here just to torture you a bit more. Just look at this. It's just going to all crumble out of there. Look at that. Absolutely horrible. And this used to be a lovely Diane Townsend, and it's just falling out the end of the pastel. Look at that. Oh, there's one little piece. I'll save that. So I think I've had enough for one day. That took me much longer than I expected. And I'm going to come back to this all fresh tomorrow, and we're going to make some new pastels out of all of that mess. Well, it's the next day, and I am feeling more motivated to have some fun with all of this pigment and to hopefully stick some of it back into pastel stick shapes. I've got a bit of a cold this week, so yesterday's task was not fun, and I'm so glad that that cleaning part is done. So what's next? Well, I've picked through the trays as best I can and taken out any of the shards that I think will still be useful. It looks like there's still a lot of shards here, but most of what's left here is actually too crumbly. It's too fragile to actually be applied. So I think it's better to just crush what's left and see what we get with the new pastel sticks. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of separate off some of the colours because they broke kind of in their places in the trays. I do get a sense of some different colour groups here, so I'm not just going to mix it all together. I am going to try and separate off some of the pigments.
So I'm just going to scoop them all into some separate little jars. And I was pleasantly surprised actually how much I managed to keep the colour groups together. So I'm actually not going to make too many neutral colours by the look of it. I should get some pretty full chroma colours back from this mess. And then as I was scooping the pigment here, I was also picking out some bits of fluff, some extra bits of dog hair. So trying to make the pigment as clean as possible. I'm sure there will be some bits of dog hair in these new pastels, but hey, that cannot be completely helped. And all the way through the process, I ended up picking out some bits of dog hair thanks to Django. But I got about 6 or 7 little jars of pigment here, and that is going to be enough to make quite a few pastels, hopefully. So quite a good amount of pigment to play with and reasonably well defined colour groups. So I didn't end up with a lot of extremely mixed together neutral pigment colours. I should get some reasonably vibrant colours back out of this.
So what will you need if you want to do this as well? It's actually not that complicated. I've got a pestle and mortar for crushing up some of the pigment, but if you don't have one of these, you could just put it in a plastic bag and crush it with a spoon. Anything will do. I've got some distilled water, which is what I'm going to add to the pigment to make it a paste again. And we need to use distilled water so that we're not adding any of the extra things that you find in tap water. So ideally distilled water. And I'm also going to have some of that in a little spray bottle because as I'm mixing up the paste, it's going to be trying to dry out. So I'm going to keep it wet by spraying it a little with this. I've got a couple of palette knives to help me shape and cut the pastel shapes. And I've got a sheet of glass on which I am going to do the mixing of the paste and the shaping of the pastels. And then finally, I've just got a sheet of tin foil beside me here, and I will put some of my kitchen roll on top of that, and that's where the pastel sticks are going to dry. So it's really as simple as that. Let's give it a try.
First task is to grind all of these bits and pieces back into nice fine powder, and I use my pestle and mortar for that. You can still see that I am picking out a few bits of fluff and dog hairs from the mix. As I ground it into a fine powder, it became easier and easier to spot those little hairs in there. So I just tried to grind this as finely and evenly as possible and to clean out any of the debris from within the mix. And finally, that small amount of blue pigment that I had, probably not enough to make one whole stick, but certainly will be useful for mixing into some of the other colours. So here we go with pastel number 1. And I have time-lapsed this because I have included all of the pastel making that I did here so that you can see how I progressed. And I took absolutely ages with this first one because as you can see, I'm adding a little bit of water, I'm adding a little bit more pigment. I'm really trying to get a feel for how much water I need to put in the mixture. So I think about a big spoon and a half or 2 spoons of the pigment was good to make quite a large stick. And then I just added a little bit of water at a time until I had it in like a thick, pasty kind of mixture. It's hard to explain until you actually do it because you do get a feel for when you're trying to shape the pastels how wet it needs to be. And there were a few times that I made it a little bit too wet and had to add a bit more pigment into the mixture. So I was really feeling my way through this process. And as I did progress through the pastels, I did get a little bit better at it. But I've got to say, this is actually much, much harder than it looks. It was especially hard to shape the pastels and to get them off the little palette knives when I would set them on the tissue paper there to dry. So very tricky, I've got to say, very, very tricky. And then you can see sometimes I'm adding in another bit of pigment. The small amount of blue violet that I had was really nice to mix into some of these greens and to give me some nice in between values that will be no doubt quite useful. So I ended up getting more colours than the number of jars of pigment that I had. And with some of those greens, I made quite big pastel sticks because I do use greens sometimes on larger bits of background, and it would be nice to have a really big stick to use for that. If I had made smaller sticks, I could have mixed way more colours using all of the pigment that I had. And I also went for a square-edged shape of pastel. That seemed like the most doable, the easiest one. I know that Unison, one of my favorite brands, they hand roll their pastels so that they're this lovely, quite uniform round shape. And having played with this pigment now, I really have no idea how they managed to do that so skillfully. It would definitely take a while to get the knack of it. And then there are some other brands who use molds to create the shape of their pastels. I think this would have been the best way for me if I had a little mold that I could put the pigment into and then pop them out of it. But as you can see here, I just had a lot of fun with the two palette knives, trying my best to make reasonably square edged shapes. And then, like I said, the trickiest part I found was actually getting them off the palette knife in one piece onto their drying tissue paper. But I had a lot of fun doing this. As I said, I could have mixed a lot more colours, but I was really pleased with the little palette of colours that I did end up with.
Well, that was messy, but here are some lovely sticks. Not the most uniform shapes, but I'm going to leave them to dry now. It should take at least 24 hours, and I'm going to try and set them in the sunshine for a little while. And then I'll check on them about halfway through, and perhaps I'll be able to come and actually trim some of the edges, some of the ends of the pastels, and shape them a little bit better. So let's leave them now to dry.
This is later on that same night, maybe about 5 hours after I made them. And as they were starting to firm up a little bit, I was able to come back in with the two palette knives and shape them a little bit better so I could make the edges a little bit neater. And then a few hours after that, just before I went to bed, I came and checked on them again, and they were just about firm enough for me to take a knife and chop off some of the rougher edges. So this is the next morning, and I finally found some sunshine to set them in. And here is a little morag. The main reason why I normally do shut my studio door tight. This is the one I thought would cause a catastrophe, if I'm honest.
So it's the next day, and they are finally dry. So let's see what we got and how they behave.
So here are the colours that I got. Not the most uniform looking sticks. I couldn't seem to decide on what size I wanted to make them. But now that they are completely dry, if I wanted to, I could neaten up the edges of them even more. So I've got a sheet of UArt paper here. That's quite a sanded surface. And I can just rub each side on this to smooth them off a little bit more, make them a bit more square. And just do the two ends as well. But to be honest, I wasn't too annoyed with the shapes that I got. The main thing that I would say is that you can see some little specks of the other colours when you start to use the pastels. So my advice, if you're doing this, would be to crush that pigment really well. Make sure that you've mixed the pigment really, really well and that there are no bits of pastel left within the mix. So if I was doing it again, that would be something I would perhaps do a little better next time. But on the whole, I am really pleased with how they are making marks. If anything, they are perhaps just a little bit harder than the Unison pastels that they are mostly made from. But we have a lot of different brands in the mix of these. There are Unisons, some Terry Ludwigs, especially in the red tones here, we've got some Diane Townsend, Art Spectrum. So I'm pretty pleased with how they all mixed. and how they behave on the paper.
Well, that's not such a bad selection of colours to come out of all that mess. Thank you to Django for gifting me the experience of doing this and for proving to me that I have always been right to close my studio door tight. It's been a lesson well learned, but also an interesting lesson in how pastels are actually made. And now I can get back to work and choose some colours for the next piece that's going on my easel, now that I can actually see all of my colours again. And maybe I'll be able to make use of some of my new Django special edition. Any ideas what I should call this collection of colours? I sure can't call it any of the brands that went into it, as a bit like Django, they are now mixed breed. But I hope that you have enjoyed this video and that maybe it will inspire you to not only make use of every single crumb of soft pastel, but every precious speck of dust too. May you never have a studio catastrophe like I did, but I'm betting that many of you artists out there with animals probably have some similar stories to tell. Let me know in the comments below. And lastly, please do remember to hit subscribe here and to check out my Patreon for all of my full-length tutorials. But thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy pasteling or happy pastel making.